All right, I see that lots of people are joining in. Thank you for joining FPSA's webinar today, brought to you by the Women's Alliance Network.
Hi, Kathleen. Sorry about that. I accidentally hung up the phone. Yeah, so I'm starting the barcast.
Hi, thank you for joining today's FPSA webinar, brought to you by the Women's Alliance Network. My name is Kathleen Chance, and I am the co-chair of the Professional Development Committee. I know that we have people from the East Coast and Central time zones, so good afternoon. And then we've got a few people from the Pacific West here. So good morning to you. Today's webinar is going to be moderated by Carmen Brown, who is a Women Alliance Network member, and I will be your facilitator. Just a few housekeeping items here. We will be taking questions using the question box throughout the webinar, so you can just type in your questions there, and all of the questions will be addressed during the Q&A portion of the presentation. After the webinar, you'll receive a prompt to complete a quick survey.
That's hilarious. Oh, and I got this too. Oh, you don't like pumpkin spice, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you do?
I was in the love group.
All right, so before we get started, I'd like to briefly tell you a little bit more about the Women's Alliance Network and how you can get involved.
You're very small.
So someone has their mic on, and we can hear you laughing and giggling. Thank you. All right, so before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of information about the Women's Alliance. The purpose is to establish a forum to facilitate positive transformation for women in the food industry. We also do have men as part of the group, so we're not eliminating that at all. We've got about 150 members right now. And if you'd like to get involved, we have a number of committees you can join. We have an events committee, a professional development committee, a membership committee, and a fundraising committee. I'm part of the professional development committee, and we are responsible for putting on the webinars. We put on iChats, which is where we actually do a more interactive conversation, and we also have a book club. So we do have a few upcoming activities and events. So we have our second book club reading The Male Factor on Friday the 8th at 2 to 3 Eastern Standard Time. We have a webinar coming in mid-December, and stay tuned for more information about that. We also have a mentoring program coming soon. So look out for information about that. We hope to kick that off in January of 2020. And then we also have the FPSA annual conference being scheduled for March 2020 in Carlsbad, California. So more information will be coming to you about how to get signed up for that. Down below, you'll see a link on how to get to the Women's Alliance website, and you'll find a lot of great information there. I'd like to now introduce you to Carmen Brown. She's a member of our Professional Development Committee, and she's the person who did all of the research and the legwork necessary to find and confirm today's speaker. Carmen?
Thank you very much. I'm Carmen Brown, and I got to know about Alita before I actually met Alita. So through one of my friends, she had met Alita at a networking event, I believe, and now works with Alita as she helps their company grow with their diversity, equity, and inclusion program. The words that she used to describe Alita as she gave rave reviews of her included brilliant and inspirational. So when we had this topic come up, I thought of Alita and I reached out to my friend to introduce us, and I'm really glad that she did, and I'm really glad that you're here, so thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to get to know all of you too during this webinar.
Oh, there's our faces.
So we're going to get started. I want to make sure that folks can see our slides and that we're controlling our slides here. I don't know if we're showing up right now.
Christine, can you make sure that the slides are showing? Right now we don't see anything.
All right, there we go. Thanks so much, Christine. So today we're here to talk about really planning for the unplanned. So how do we make the most of career defining moments? And the way that we started to talk about this, when I originally met with Carmen, and as I've learned for the organizers here, what the most important challenges or changes you're facing are, we started to think about what do you do in the face of change? How do you take change, whether it's planned or unplanned, and make the most of it so that you can seize on opportunities professionally that allow for you to be aligned to your purpose, to your vision for yourself in the future, and to the path that you really want to forge for yourself. So in thinking about that today, what we're focusing on is really understanding what our learning objectives are so that we can make the most out of this learning experience. I also want to touch on gender inclusivity. When we're talking about issues of change, it's important to understand that we're not always coming from the same places, that some folks in dominant groups are always going to be coming from a system of advantage, and those who are not will be in a place of disadvantage. So understanding the playing field you're really starting from is critical to planning for change, so that you know what obstacles you may face in the future. From there, we're going to talk about how we can start with why to really plan for change in an intentional way, even if we don't know what those changes are. And then we'll talk about two really key tools for one, developing the self-awareness and self-management from an emotional intelligence perspective to really be able to grapple with change in a way that feels right, but also tools to maximizing on the effects of change in groups and with others. And then finally, we'll leave time for questions at the end. We will have some interactivity during this session, so please do make use of that questions tab in the GoToMeeting, but I wanted to make sure that we had a good lay of the land for what we're going into. If that sounds like a lot for the next hour, I just want to emphasize to you that I am here to serve you and to give you the information and tools that you need. So if at any point we need to slow down or you need resources after today's session, I'm happy to share them with you. I think it's really important to keep learning events continuing after the first hour or the first session. But I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. Thank you, Carmen, for the introduction. I'm Alita Miranda Wolf, and I run a company called Ethos. So what we do is we help growing and growth stage companies achieve profitability and scale by investing in their people and culture. Really what we do is we create the conditions for everyone to thrive at work, and specifically do so in a way that allows for companies to become incredible and incredibly diverse in their cultures. I came to this work via a very circuitous route that for me is my career defining moment. And so I thought I would start today's session by talking about that career defining moment, and specifically that pivot. So to give you a little bit more understanding on me, I am someone who has never really gone the route planned. I thought that I would. I grew up in an immigrant household. I come from a family of Cuban refugees, and work has always been about survival. It has not been about thriving. And so the first time I thought I might even become an entrepreneur, because I was trying to understand what an entrepreneur was, I was 16 years old, and I asked my mom, "What's an entrepreneur?" And she said, "It is someone who is unemployed and doesn't want to admit it." And so that was my introduction to a non-traditional path. And so, like a lot of people who grow up in similar households, I pursued a law path and then had a defining moment where I was hit by a car. I had to relearn how to walk and had reconstructive surgery. And during that time, I realized I did not want to become a lawyer and started to pursue a path in technology. So adjacent to entrepreneurship, but technology focused. And I ended up coming into an opportunity in venture capital. So I joined the venture capital firm Hyde Park Angels, and I was the first woman to ever join that team. I was the only Hispanic person working in venture capital in Chicago, and I was just one of 27 Latino women in VC nationally. I was also the youngest person in my role by 10 years. And I had these really huge challenges to grapple with. For one, our goal as an organization was to become best in class, but we had a middling reputation, and we had just gone through a huge amount of organizational change because our leadership had completely turned over. I was brought on board to help build the strategy to get us to that growth. And what I can say is that for much of my time there, that is in fact what I did. It was extremely challenging, and I came to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion because I felt personal stakes. I had to manage these investors who could not relate to me. I was a daughter to them. I was someone to ask how old they were while presenting in board meetings. I was someone who they had trouble seeing as an equal, or even in some cases as their manager, which is what I was. And so I fought my way through that by changing the culture of the organization and building this path for myself where I said, we're going to differentiate ourselves in market by taking a people first approach to investing, which means we have to change as an organization who is in our organization and how they operate. What that meant for me was in my first 2 years, I was known as the angel of death in my firm because I fired 60 of my own investors by developing a proprietary score to measure the value they added to our portfolio companies. And I was able to create this whole process and system for bringing people into the organization who could really grow our companies because they had operational expertise and the net worth to do it. But I was also able to, because we were taking this unexpected turn, bring in diversity. So I was able to increase diversity in our investor base by 25%. I was able to increase the number of female-founded companies in our portfolio from 3% to 20%, about the same for people of color. And by the time I was done, which was 3.5 years in with this initiative, the top 3 performing companies in our portfolio were led by women and people of color, proving the business case. And on top of that, we had become the most active investor in the Midwest. And all we had done was change people. So people hear the story and they say, why did you ever leave? You were able to make the change you wanted to see. You were able to forge this path for yourself. You were second in command in this firm where there didn't seem like a whole lot of possibility when you started out that you would be second in command. Why would you leave? And this is my career defining moment. Truthfully, I was working 80 hours a week. I was having fainting spells from exhaustion. I ran 4 parts of a 5-part business. I ran everything to do with our investors, our portfolio company growth, our Fortune 500 partners, and our community and marketing. And I had hit my ceiling. I remember sitting down with my managing director and telling him that I was in this very strange place because I was burnt out, and burnout here, of course, meaning exhaustion, cynicism, and feelings of underperformance. And I didn't know where else to go or what else to do. And I had some ideas, but I wasn't sure if I could pursue them. And he looked at me directly and he said, the only job that is left for you in this firm, Alita, is mine. And I'm not going to give that to you. And it was the first time that I had ever thought that this wasn't going to be the place I was going to stay, that this wasn't the place that I was going to build my career and build my life around. I had built roots in Chicago to be in this firm. My husband and I had made real decisions around it. And now I was hearing that I had 2 options. I could stay and work too hard and feel uninspired because I knew that I wasn't going to have more growth, or I could find something else. And I felt a lot of despair at that time because I had built my whole life around this work. My identity was completely enmeshed in my work. I had prioritized work over relationships, over hobbies, over other passions. It was everything to me. And there was this real low point that I think is important for me to be candid about when I'm sharing this story, where I was sitting across from him and he was frustrated with me for not being more grateful. And I said, if my work doesn't have purpose, then does my life have purpose? And it felt like such an extreme and dramatic thing to say, but again, my whole life was work. And that's when I decided that I needed to make a change. And I needed to take this opportunity to really investigate what kind of path I wanted, and if it was even in this space. And over the course of 6 months, I met with 20 individuals who I saw as potential mentors and who were leaders in basically every industry, just to understand what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of leader I wanted to be, and why. And by the end of those 6 months, it was so clear to me that all I wanted to do was help companies grow. And I wanted to help them grow in a way that allowed for me to teach love, and scale empathy. And so I did the thing I thought I would never do, which is I crossed the other side of the table. I became an entrepreneur. And in the last 18 months, I can genuinely say that I have found a calling. And for some people, work is just a job, and that's totally okay. And for some people, it's a career, which is a game to be won, a path to advance down, something to really fight for, but an element of life. And for some people, work is a calling, and a calling is really, it is all about who you are as a person, living that out in your work. And that's what I get to do. But I want to own that there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of change, and there was a lot of questioning on my part. I'm so glad that I made the pivot. But I share this story with you because if you're in this mode of planning for the unplanned, I can't think of a better example from my own life. My whole plan was a job that I decided within about a day couldn't work anymore. And so we're going to talk about the tools that I've used and learned to really forge ahead. So starting off, I want us to just do a quick intro, understanding where we're coming from. I'm sure that we have folks all across the gender spectrum joining us today, but it's important for us to know where we stand when it comes to gender inclusivity, because when we're planning for the unplanned, specifically women and female identifying individuals have more challenges professionally in making transitions and taking leaps. Part of it is because of data that we know from McKinsey and from the Lean In report, both that will be cited here today. But here's what we know. If you're in an industry where you are underrepresented as a woman, and this is part of why I chose to study, I've been a woman only in most of the companies that I have joined, you often are experiencing some challenges that men are not. So you're experiencing challenges where you feel that your judgment is questioned in your area of expertise, you're often addressed in a less than professional way, you often have to provide more evidence of your competence than others do. You are mistaken for someone at a much lower level than you are. Candidly, I am still mistaken as an intern. I have had that happen recently, and I am the CEO of my own company. And then hearing demeaning remarks about people like you. So if you've ever heard a "you know how women are" joke, this is probably you in this category. And what all of this does is it creates a lack of confidence in women who are experiencing these challenges, because we take cues from our social environments, we internalize them, and we tell ourselves stories about them. So we feel that we're going to have an uphill battle if we transition, if we change our path, if we try to go for a different position in our firms, if we try to leave our firms, if we even just want a promotion. It's all of these social signals that get sent to us that might keep us from doing more. And then there are some other real social challenges that get in the way. For one, there are 2 different studies on listening that have come out in the last few years. And the headline here is that women are interrupted by men a whole lot more than men are interrupted by women or other men. In the UC Santa Barbara study, which is the one that often gets gasps from folks when I'm in a keynote setting, what they found is in social conversations of about an hour, men interrupted each other 7 times each, but men interrupted women 46 times, and women interrupted men twice. In a more conservative study that came out of George Washington, which looked at professional conversations where etiquette is more likely to be upheld, they still found that men were interrupting women about 33% more than men. And what does that do? Well, when people don't listen, we have a response. If I'm interrupted 46 times in an hour-long conversation, that might mean that I'm afraid to talk. So I don't surface my ideas, I don't speak up, I don't raise my hand. But what happens when we don't communicate? We don't connect. And so we don't build important contacts, we don't build important relationships, which means we don't have the same access to information. You don't have the same access to information. How can you make big decisions? How can you negotiate, right? How can I know what I'm worth if I don't have a benchmark from anyone else? And then that leads to fewer opportunities. So we don't know that that promotion is available. We don't know that that opportunity at another company is available. We don't know how much we have to offer as ourselves. And these are not necessarily things that all women or female identifying individuals face, but are much more likely to face because of our social conditioning. And one thing I should say, and I try to be careful about this, with the listening studies, where that data is coming from is just social conditioning. So it's not that men are the worst. It's that the way that we end up socializing our kids, we tell girls not to interrupt, and we don't tell boys. We tell boys to be assertive, to get their ideas on the table, to take control and take charge of a conversation. We tell girls to be deferential and polite and be good listeners. And then there's modeling all around us that reinforces patterns of behavior on both sides. But it doesn't change the fact that it has an impact on women who are dealing with change and who, as a result, may not feel like they can have their voices heard and may not feel confidence in themselves. That all gets exacerbated by the way that we talk about women in the workplace. So in an important study done on the US military, what they found is in performance reviews, one, we are more likely to describe women with negative terms than men. And those terms are very gendered. So frivolous, scattered, passive, gossip, vain. These are the ways in which people describe women in the armed services in performance evaluations, over almost 11,000. And these are messages these women are hearing, but also are being reinforced by the environment, which again impacts the way they see themselves, impacts the way that they show up to the world and how they speak, and then just creates a bigger climb for selling themselves on new opportunities. All of this is to say that we live in a world where we have to acknowledge the gender double bind. Women who don't speak up go unnoticed. So we think about that listening example, right? Women who don't speak up, don't form those connections, don't seize on those opportunities. Women who do speak up get rejected. They get called frivolous and vain and scattered and aggressive. But there are ways that we can deal with these challenges and understand these challenges by preparing ourselves and giving ourselves the tools to know what we want, define what we want, and use some tools to take care of ourselves when we face adversity, but also to break down barriers and make people listen. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of today on. So if any of that was a bummer to you, we're all into the good stuff now.
So Alita, before moving forward, that's a lot of data right there. So what are some takeaways from this data that we can keep in mind throughout this webinar?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we are facing challenge from a gender perspective. And this is really critical to remember because I'm a performance coach. I have about 50 coaching clients, and more than half of them are women. And when I talk to them, they often say, am I crazy? What am I doing wrong? Is it me? Because it seems like no one else is having these issues on my team. And no matter what I do, no matter how many times I try to speak up, I'm just not being heard. What's wrong with me? What I think is important about the data is that it shows us that the group is having this cumulative experience. It is not an individual experience where you are doing something wrong or you are fundamentally lacking.
Okay, that's good to keep in mind. And then also, for those that don't identify as female that are listening, how can they use this data?
Absolutely. So if you, one, are familiar with gender and gender identity, so you are not female identifying, but others identify you as a woman, there are real challenges. So that's one thing I just want to own. We see this in trans men all the time, that when they undergo transition, they feel that they have a lot more respect, credibility, and authority when they are perceived as being male in their communities. So for one, how you are characterized or seen is going to affect how you can manage change. But if you are going through any kind of transition or change, a few things to remember if you are, let's say, male on the phone joining along. For one, know that there are real challenges associated with you based on your intersectionality and your identity. So you may have noticed in that original data that men do experience some of those elements too in smaller numbers, but they experience it. So that might be something that you face, especially if you are under 40, or if you are a person of color, if you have a disability, if you are open about a sexual orientation that is not the norm, you're likely to face some of the similar challenges here. And then if you are part of the dominant group and dealing with transition, it's important to know that you actually do have a voice and you do have power. So as you work on supporting yourself, if you use that to support others, you bring the whole community up with you.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about planning for change. So when we talk about change, the thing that I want to emphasize to you is your vision of who you want to be is the greatest asset you have. You cannot score if you don't have a goal. So whenever we're talking about change and transformation, we have to understand what is it that we actually want for ourselves? What is the highest vision of ourselves in the future? This may seem really broad and nebulous to you, and I know from where I was 5 years ago in my career, it sounded like a bunch of new age hullabaloo. I just wanted a path. I wanted steps. I wanted things I could check off. I wanted to be high performing, and I wanted the straight A's and everything. That's how I felt. And then as I started progressing through my career, I understood that I needed to learn to start with why. So if anyone here is familiar with Simon Sinek, he wrote a book called Start With Why. His TED Talk on this is the second most watched in the world. His innovation was to observe that when we talk about anything, whether it's a product or a service or ourselves, we tend to start with what instead of with why. So think about yourselves in the audience here. If you are introducing yourself, don't you normally introduce yourself by your job title and where you work? That's your what, that's what you do. But is that your guiding light? Is that really the intention behind all of your work? It ends up being important for a really specific reason. So why is what gets to other people. The decision-making part of your brain is your limbic brain, which is where emotions live, but language does not live there. Language lives in your neocortex, in the more evolved part of your brain, newly evolved part of your brain. And so we listen to our neocortex all the time because that's what's talking to us, but it's not where decisions come from. That gut feeling is coming from your limbic brain, and your limbic brain cares about why, does not care about what, can't even process what. And so when we're thinking about how we can be persuasive, but also know ourselves, we have to go back to that core why. What is our purpose? What is our cause? What is our belief? Why do we exist? Why does that matter to other people? And from there, we can go into our how. So what sets us apart? What are our special qualities or characteristics? How do we do things differently? What do we value? What guides us in our behaviors? And our what is what we do. So if we understand the golden circle and we learn to connect with this why, we can start thinking about purpose statements for ourselves, which can guide us through any change because we always know what we're tracking towards, right? And so if we think about that with the purpose statement in mind, the beginning of a purpose statement, which is normally about 3 sentences, is if your why were to come to life in the future. It's who you aspire to be. The middle of that purpose statement is the actionable characteristics and behaviors of how you achieve that vision. Basically, the way you want to do what you do. And then the end is really what you'll bring to life. Sometimes this is hard to imagine or conceptualize, so for your benefit, here's mine. So in my personal purpose statement, my why is in green. Now, I believe that it's everyone's responsibility to make the world more beautiful in their own unique ways. My why is to make the world more beautiful by helping people be kinder, smarter, and better at working on teams. Then I can think about, okay, a lot of people might want to do that. How do I do that in a way that's unique to me? That's my how. That's what's in orange. Seeing the genius in others, always learning, knowing the why behind everything that I do, only putting work into the world that I'm proud of. That's what guides me towards that vision of myself. My what? Helping growing and growth stage companies build incredible and incredibly diverse company cultures that feel they're successful. That's what ethos does. That's my what. Now, here's what I want to emphasize, 2 points on this. Your personal purpose statement can be tied to your work, but does not only encompass work. It should be broad enough to think about your whole self. Now, mine is very work related because like I said earlier, work for me is a calling and I want that, but I could help people be kinder, smarter, and better at working on teams in a lot of different ways. My why stays the same year after year, but the way that I practice it, the way that it comes into my what can change. I don't have to do my why at ethos. That yellow line can change and I can still live it. And that's something that's really important for you to remember. If you have a really strong why and a set of values and principles in your how, no matter what changes you face in your what, you'll be prepared because you'll be able to find a better what, and you'll have the tools at your disposal to be able to flex and adapt when it needs to change. I did say this is going to be interactive, so I actually want all of us on the line here to, for the next 5 minutes, and I will time you, try to write your own. Why 5 minutes? Because I have sat with folks in rooms who have stared at a page for an hour and written nothing. It's important to have a time limit on this because it's a really big question. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to have everybody here write your why, your how, and your what in that order. There's some guiding questions here on this slide so that you can think about them and go back to them. And I'll flip back to my purpose statement after a few seconds so that you can process the questions and go along. But I'm going to start my timer right now, and we're going to go. So everybody, go. You're a minute in. And I will encourage you to share what you come up with in the questions section. So even if you don't feel like it's 100% after the next few minutes, we'd love to see what you come up with.
Alita, this is Christine. Oh, you saw it. Never mind. Thanks.
If you need the instructions on what to do, you're just answering those 3 questions and turning them into a statement. Take another minute and a half. Start getting ready to share. All right, finish up that last thought. So hopefully you can type in what you came up with, but I will say this, Carmen has agreed to be our tribute here and share her statement with all of us. What did you come up with, Carmen?
Okay, so we're gonna start with the why. And for those that don't personally know me, I will go with the career side of my life. I'm a project manager at Epstein, where we design and build of food and beverage manufacturing facilities in my department. So give you my background. So my why is while you're working on making the world more beautiful, I'm trying to make it more successful. I audibled on that one by helping people define and plan paths to their goals and work with them on executing those plans. My how, I went with my core values and envelope that. So I seek and promote original ideas, keep a strong backbone of my moral values, and find enjoyment along the way in order to help food and beverage manufacturers design and build operational growth aligned with their strategic goals.
Great work. Really appreciate you sharing. I hope that you will all share with us what your statements are, but the big thing that I want to keep in mind in terms of what we learned here was that we have some thoughts nascent in us around this, and it can be hard, it can be challenging to put these together because the questions feel big. But if we ask ourselves these questions on a regular basis, when we're faced with change, we know what to do because we've already had the time to reflect. We already know what it is we want. So if I go back to Carmen's statement, which is about helping people get to their goals, the biggest thing is know what your goals are. I often say this about myself. As soon as I define what it is that I want, it becomes much more possible to have it because I see opportunities for it everywhere. But before I do, I'm unsure, I'm uncertain, and so I don't know what to pursue. And I'm much more likely to be influenced by the should problem. I should do this. My friends think I should do this. My mom thinks I should do this. My boss thinks I should do this. But what is it that I feel called to do? That's the really key question. So I'm going to take a pause here and see if there are any questions from folks before we go into tools and application.
Okay.
Do you have a question, Carmen?
I do. So you were talking about that these can be about not just our careers, but about our lives. Are we intended to do this about our holistic lives, or is it recommended to do it that way, or going along the path of, is it a calling, is it a career, or is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So with these statements, I really recommend making them holistic and trying to think about your whole life. But if you want to put a career emphasis on them, that can be a lot easier because you have a container around what you're saying. There may be so much left for you to explore in your life, or so many new avenues to try, that it can be overwhelming. So think about the kind of person you want to be. But if framing it in terms of work is helpful, that's why that last statement is so important as an anchor.
Yeah, the what and the career definitely made it feasible for me to write this in 5 minutes.
Right. It helps narrow down our options. All right. I want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So I'm going to take us through some tools that we can use for planning for the unplanned. So the first tool that I want to talk to you about is all about optimism. So we can actually cultivate our sense of optimism and groundedness at the same time. First, we have to understand what optimism is, because a lot of times when we think of optimism, we think of naivete, we think of innocence, we think of not really understanding or knowing the world. And so that's why I say optimism and groundedness, because groundedness is our sense of being rooted, right? Optimism is our sense of really hopefulness and confidence about the future. Okay, so optimism is about believing in a better future. When we're confronting change, if we can see change as an opportunity instead of as a risk, it completely alters the way that we interact with it. So optimism is necessary, but it helps us because it ultimately gets us into that positive framing. We don't want to veer so far into optimism that we lose sight of reality, so we stay grounded in what it is we know of ourselves and the world, but we do think about how to believe in a better future. And the way that we can do that is a model called PERMA. So this came from Martin Seligman, who is probably one of the most famous positive psychologists today alive. And PERMA is literally the model that he has found over 30 years of research and studying that makes people happy. So where does happiness come from? It comes from 5 areas. It comes from positive emotions, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Specifically, positive emotions. This is all about how you feel. Do you feel pleasure? Do you feel happiness? Do you feel joy and inspiration? When we're cultivating optimism, what we can think about here is, okay, say that there's going to be a big change in our career path or in our role or in even the company that we're working in. What is it that we can get in touch with that makes us feel happy? That is data for us in thinking about how we approach the change. The next one here, experience, that's being present with a situation or a task or a process. What does it do? It allows for us to really see what's around us, interact with it, and instead of going into conflict avoidance and clinging to the past or being so far into the future that we can't appreciate what's going on around us, it allows us to see with clear eyes, which allows for that groundedness. Positive relationships. When we are going through change, we need more of a support system than we are not. And this is true for just happiness generally. But our support system, in this case, is about deep, continuously renewed connections, meaningful relationships. So when you think about change, a lot of times the way people approach it is they say, okay, I'm going to network. I'm going to expand my social circle. I'm going to add 100 new people. That actually isn't going to contribute to a sense of happiness. Often it will lead to restlessness and feelings of lack of control. When you're going through change, when you're planning for the unplanned, when you're dealing with change that's on the horizon, what really helps is a few very close, deep relationships that you're constantly making investments in. Meaning is about thinking about a cause bigger than ourselves and aligning that purpose with our daily activity. So again, in thinking about change, those purpose statements, they don't just give us a sense of direction, they make us happy. They bring us closer to these feelings of contentment and joy and inspiration. And then finally, accomplishment, the successful pursuit of small daily goals. So one thing that people often neglect when they're going through changes is the importance of small, quick wins. I can tell you that the period in my life where I was most unhappy was also the period in my life where I had the greatest amount of achievement. But my projects were huge, my milestones were gigantic, and I got totally depleted in their pursuit. And I wasn't focusing on my small daily goals that were tied to my purpose. So I wasn't doing my morning routine. I wasn't reading the books I wanted to read. I wasn't calling my best friend on the phone. And doing those things because I had goals around them every day gave me a little bit of recharge on that long-term battery. When I was just going after the big stuff and not thinking about those small accomplishments, I tired myself out and I went long stretches of feeling starved for positive reinforcement because it took so long to get to the win. So that's how you prepare yourself for change. How do you think about happiness really shapes the way that you ultimately engage with happiness? So you want to understand that happiness comes from this model and that when we're thinking about work, we should be thinking about happiness and we should be thinking about how to be happy at work. Now, we can move into this thinking about how to position yourself to others. And this is where we'll spend our last 5 minutes before we open up to questions. So in terms of positioning yourselves, you have to be able to get other people's buy-in. If we go back to that gender inclusivity point, there are a lot of challenges that you may face in being listened to, in being talked about, in being received. How do you break those barriers down? You've already built the resilience, if you're using PERMA, to withstand and overcome challenge. But how do you help people see that you can pursue this purpose statement, that what you're putting yourself out there for, you can and should have? This comes down to story. So it turns out the most persuasive tool that we have is story. And there's a really simple reason for that. Story connects information. It makes it a lot easier for us to process. When you tell someone a story, what it is these connected events, whether they're real or imaginary, the sequence of written or spoken words, still or moving images, basically any kind of connection, you do the work for them. They don't have to put the pieces together. When you're thinking about buy-in, the first thing you have to think about is how to make it easy for someone else to understand your point. And story makes it cognitively easy to process information. Now, not all stories are created equal. Great stories come down to 4 key elements. The first is something that I totally stole from the Moth. So if you're interested in good stories, you should listen to the Moth podcast or go to one of their shows. But it's a storytelling competition. And what the founder of the Moth said is that great stories are about decisions you made, not what happened to you. When you're talking about the unplanned, when you're talking about change and navigating transition, being able to tell a story about how you were the protagonist, how you got to that turning point, how you made that decision, it puts people in the place to listen, to respect, and to follow you. Great stories also reveal something that's authentic and true. It connects with people on a deeper level. They have a unique and distinct tone and voice. I used to teach writing, and one of the things that came up all the time with my students is they did not want to read novels because they said, well, I will never have an original thought if I just read other people's work. I have to stay in a bubble, so everything that I put out there is totally new and my own. And I would laugh in their faces because that's completely impossible. We have lived on this world as humans for way too long for anything to be original. The only thing that you can do differently, not idea-wise, it's not idea-wise. It's about how you say it. It's about the perspective you bring. The way you see the world is what is unique to you, and that should be reflected in your stories. What is true for you? How do you say it in your own voice? And then finally, this last point is about audience. I can tell Carmen a story and she can think it's great, and I can tell Christine a story and she can think it's the worst. And it really just depends on who my audience is. Is it relevant to them? Is it specific to them? Does it resonate with them and their experience? Great stories take into account who is being told the story. Now, there are 6 principles of persuasion that help make stories really convincing, and I'm going to teach these to you right now, and I'm going to encourage you to use them after today. The first principle of persuasion is reciprocity, and it's really simple. Reciprocity is all about this idea that from a psychological standpoint, people feel obliged to give to people who have given to them. If you think about the act of gift giving, when someone gives to me, I feel like giving back. So if you think about why Me Too has been so successful as a movement, it's because people have shared vulnerable stories. They have given something to others who are facing similar experiences, and that has compelled others to share back. A more nefarious example of this was the Hare Krishnas in the 1960s. They were trying to raise money for their religion in the US, and they couldn't because everyone thought they were a cult. And so what they did was they started going to airports with flowers. And they would put flowers in people's hands, and you would see this really strange phenomenon of airport dwellers looking back at these Hare Krishnas with contempt and handing them money because they had just been given a flower. They felt they had to give something back. When we share first, others share back. The next principle of persuasion is scarcity. This is FOMO, right? People want more of those things that they have less of or might miss out on. So when you're trying to persuade somebody, when you're facing change, when you're saying, look, you've got to capitalize on me as a bet, as a resource, the attitude here is, these are all of the things that I could be doing, but I'm not because I'm in the wrong position. Or you can use regret, this is what you might miss out on, or you can use time, but you can basically create a sense of urgency with scarcity, and urgency is persuasive. The third principle is authority, and this is a very simple principle. People follow the lead of credible, knowledgeable experts. If you've ever seen a toothpaste commercial, you know what this story looks like. 4 out of 5 dentists agree that Colgate is the most whitening toothpaste. The whole idea behind this is if you establish that you are the expert, that you have the knowledge, that you understand what it is you're talking about, people are more likely to be persuaded by you. We often take for granted that people know that we're the expert. And because of that gender inclusivity work that we did earlier in the session, you might be in a position to say, but when I try to establish my authority, people won't believe me. But if you learn to tell stories about your expertise, and you can show them through story how you've solved a problem or been successful, you're much more likely to succeed, regardless of how the cards may be stacked against you. The fourth principle is consistency, and this is a really simple one. People like to be consistent with the things they have previously said or done. I have used this very successfully with clients. So I had a client in particular who did not want to share critical information with the organization before it was fully baked. And the person in the room who was the decision maker said, we have to share it for the sake of transparency now. And I reminded the naysayer of a principle they have, which is clarity. And I said, don't you think, based on what you said a few meetings ago, that if we're too transparent, we're unclear, and so people won't understand? I mean, I really admired the way that you thought about that situation, and it could be really useful to apply that here. And he said, you just used my words against me. Yeah, okay, it's not ready to be shared. We have to wait a little bit longer. But the point being, it was very persuasive because people like to do what they said they were going to do. Mm-hmm. The fifth is liking, and this is my favorite one to teach because there are 3 ways to get someone to like you. People prefer to say yes to people they like. There are 3 ways. How do you get someone to like you? You establish a mutual goal. You give them compliments that are specific and sincere, and you establish how you're similar. Those are the 3 ways you can get somebody to like you. It's why there are all of these, they're just like us, magazine articles and web links, right? It is a way of making people feel similar. And then finally, our last one is social proof. And social proof is that people will look to the actions of others to determine their own. It's essentially that we're cheap, right?
All the cool kids are doing it.
Yeah, exactly. We do what other people do. So when you're telling stories around this persuasion principle, it's about talking about what competitors are doing or folks that you admire are doing or folks that specifically your audience admires, but pointing to other examples, other evidence. And what I'll say about social proof is audience is really key here. You don't want to tell somebody that you're trying to persuade about a group that they don't like or don't want to be like, because that will not be persuasive. So knowing them a little bit better helps here. So with those 6 principles of persuasion, here are your next steps before we go into questions. This is an exercise that we typically do, but it's called storytelling to persuade. And the whole idea is that you're going to take an area where you want to advocate for yourself. And I know we talked about the FPSAA mentoring program a little bit at the beginning of this. If you're going to a mentoring session, take this area that you want to advocate for yourself into that session and talk continuously for 2 minutes to try to persuade your mentor. It's really hard to talk for 2 minutes, just so you know. It feels like an eternity when you're just monologuing about why you deserve something. So it's a really good practice. And then once you've gone through that exercise together with your mentor, decide what you shared that worked and record that progress, and then look at areas that maybe didn't work and see how you might improve them in the future. So with that, I'm going to just leave up this review. We know that when we're facing the unknown, challenges related to gender inclusivity can create issues for women, but to face that change, we can start with why, have a good sense of purpose that leads our direction, makes things clear for us. We can use PERMA to prime us to be able to psychologically handle unexpected change. And we can use the art of storytelling and persuasion to create more opportunities no matter what you're facing, no matter what change may come. So with that, I want to ask, are there any questions?
We can give them some time to think those up and pass them through. I can start off with some questions. So it looks like these are great tools for large pivoting moments. Is there a way that we can practice these day to day when we see those smaller daily pivots?
Absolutely. So the storytelling to persuade exercise, I often encourage people to try it for things that they want but don't ask for because they think they're too small. So think about it this way. You can use liking principle in just about any situation. Let's say that you really want to be the person who leads the next meeting. You can say, hey, I know both of us really want to be clear and efficient in the way that we present this project. And we're both really motivated by this data and by this situation. And I think if I'm the one to present it in the meeting, we'll be able to really leverage that goal that we have to convince everyone else in the space. What do you think about doing that together?
It'd be really hard to say no to that.
That's the hope, right? But you can practice these for any of the little things that you want. Similarly, you're not going to come up, for a lot of people, maybe some of you will, you're not going to come up all the time with the best solution when you're talking about your purpose statement. You're not going to come up with the best what, you're not going to come up with the best why, you're not going to come up with the best how. It's okay to just socialize it with people and share the different pieces and see what happens and how they respond. And that's a way that you can deal with unexpected small pivots, because you can start to say, really, when this happened, it made me think that I have this sense of purpose around X. Let's have a conversation about it and see how I might pursue this in this particular way.
Okay, great. Yeah, I like that. We'll try and do that. Someone has asked if we can have the last screen up again for a few minutes. Okay. And it looks like people during the talk have started to send us their statements, their personal statements. Due to time, I want to allow for questions first before we read them out loud. But I think it's really cool that people are sending that in.
Thank you for sharing them.
And speaking of those, the idea of sharing my personal statement with others or practicing my storytelling to position myself makes me feel very vulnerable, and I'm secretly hoping that I'm not the only one that feels this way. What is a way that people can manage that vulnerability to then better their skills in this?
Start by building the muscle. So I have a great example. I had someone go through this storytelling to persuade exercise, and they decided to choose an area in their volunteering life related to skin cancer and awareness around skin cancer, and had that whole storytelling to persuade cycle with friends who they were trying to get to use sunscreen. It was something that mattered. It was something they wanted to advocate for. It was something they cared about, but they did it in a really safe space with people that they respect and care about, and who they knew would create an environment for them to practice, but also would allow for them to practice. The more you do it, the easier it is. The other thing to say about this in terms of feeling vulnerable around your purpose statements, it really helps if you do it with somebody else. So one of the things that I do in our companies is I make colleagues work on their purpose statements together. And because they have to work on them together, both of them have to be vulnerable. When we talk about vulnerability as something we're afraid of, we're often talking about a fear of lack of reciprocation. We're going to share and we're not going to get anything back. And so to create the conditions to go through a process or a series of questions together will allow for really a sense of safe vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And to tie that in with what you were saying before, there is science back where when people share, the other person is inclined to share back. So that vulnerability feeling is almost a mythical creature.
Well, you know, it certainly happens. And the example I can give, I was in a workshop recently where we were defining meeting norms. And one of the folks in the room said, I don't want a meeting norm to be vulnerability. I don't want to be vulnerable in this room. And another person in the room said, well, I don't feel comfortable if some people can't be vulnerable. And so there was a little bit of tension, and we talked about it a little bit more. And vulnerability is being willing to show up as you are to the people around you. And this person who said, I cannot commit to this vulnerability norm, ended up having a very deep conversation about trust, because when both of them had to engage in a conversation about trust, it was weird to not share a personal story too. So there is an element of matching that is happening here.
Interesting.
So since we just have a minute left on this webinar, I'm thinking maybe if folks are okay with it, we can read a purpose statement or two.
Okay, sure. So let's see here. We have a purpose statement in from Gabrielle, and it looks like she was able to really lean in and get past the easy career out that I did. So let's read this. She said, my passion is to raise my daughter who is compassionate about others, especially those less fortunate than herself, by being a good example and role model in my own life through volunteering at soup kitchens, being active in our church community, and having a successful career. I think that's awesome. She was able to do her whole life with that.
That's a great example of a holistic statement. Thanks so much, Gabrielle.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
I want to be conscious that we're at time.
Okay.
So I thank everybody for participating, and thank you, Carmen.
Thank you for showing up. This is great. This has been great.
Great.
And then is there a way that if people have questions that they could send them in and we could share them as well?
Absolutely. So my email address is alita@ethostalent.com, And if folks can't remember that, that's okay. Feel free to reach out to the organizers here. I'm always happy to answer questions. And to that point, there'll be a survey that'll be sent out where you can also share feedback on today.
Okay, great.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending the seminar, the webinar. We will be posting this video on our website. So give us about a day and then this will be posted on the website. So if you miss anything or you want to go back and listen to it again, it will be available for everyone. Thank you so much for attending and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.